All right, in this video, I'm gonna be walking you through the fourth principle of art, which is movement. So there are two main ways that you can capture a movement within your photography. The first is through movement of subject, and the second is through movement of the eye. So how do you guide a viewer's eye through a photo? And I'm gonna run through both of these methods in a second, but I wanted to preface this video by saying that this is not a form of photography that I shoot very often. So for the majority of the photos in this video, they're going to be from other artists. So I'm gonna credit their name below, and I'm gonna break down how these artists managed to get that shot if you want to replicate it in your own photography. So with that being said, let's start with movement of the subject. And I have 6 different ways I'm gonna show you how to do this. The first is through panning. So this essentially means you have a subject moving in your shot and you track your camera with that shot. The catch is you put your camera at a slightly long exposure, somewhere between 1/30th and 1/80th of a second, and you get the subject in focus, and if you pull it off right, you'll get a nice background blur in the background from that slightly long exposure. So I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this is a fairly difficult technique to pull off. I've tried it many times in my photography career, and I'm just not that very good at it. So I don't have any shots in my portfolio of this. I have a lot of attempts of it, but nothing that came out good. So for example, I'm gonna show you this shot right here. As you can see, the motorcycle is in perfect clarity in the center of the shot, and then we have that nice blur in the background. So I've heard that if you practice enough, you can start to get the timing right, but it just requires a really steady hand. And I'd also recommend doing it on burst mode with your camera so you can get multiple shots and hope one of them comes out. So this technique isn't just applicable to things like cars or motorcycles or action sports. You could also do it in more abstract interpretations. So for example, a lot of people like to put their camera at like 1/30th of a second, go to a place with a bunch of tall trees, and then slightly run the camera up while the shutter is open. This means you're gonna get a cool, almost kind of blurry shot of those trees, and it has almost a painterly Monet kind of look to it. So for example, check out this shot right here. As you can see, we got that nice abstract imagery, and the cool part is you're doing all this in camera. So this technique can be replicated in Photoshop fairly easily if you know what you're doing. You just have to learn how to select subjects, mask them out, and then just blur the background, which I do go through in the editing part of my course, but it's definitely more impressive to be able to do this within your camera. So if you ever have the chance, you should go out and try this. The second method to capture movement in a subject is through long exposures. And I know we've covered this pretty extensively in this course with water or clouds just to demonstrate that movement. But I wanted to run through a few more scenes where you can use long exposures in your shots. The first is with people. So if you want to get almost a haunted or double exposure-esque type of photo, set your camera on a slightly long exposure, like 1/10th to 1/30th of a second, then have that person move their head or move some aspect of their body. So for example, check out this shot by this artist right here, where you can see their head has that nice blur with all of their hair, and then they got that perfectly sharp body, and it just provides this really hauntedly awesome image. Another way you can do this is with crowds. So for example, if you have a massive amount of people moving, you can make them all look like ghosts. So check out this shot right here. As you can see, we got that crowd moving through this station right here, and then the security guards are perfectly still. So they provide a nice contrast to that busy movement of the scene. Another way you can use long exposures is with trains or light rails for that matter. So the technique is you go to either the front or the back of the train and you find a open window. So specifically one that's straight forward. Now, not every train is gonna have this. You might have to scope it out a little bit, but what you're gonna do is you're gonna set up your tripod, and when the train is moving, you're gonna take a long exposure of that train either going forward or backwards. And it's going to get a result similar to something like this. So as you can see, it's like this warp tunnel abstract kind of effect, which is a really fun way to show movement in your shots. Speaking of fun, one more way that you can use long exposures is at amusement parks. So for example, Ferris wheels have a really cool effect while they're spinning, roller coasters, and really just any ride that has a bunch of movement back and forth, you can create a cool long exposure. And I'd recommend doing this at night when all the lights are on in amusement parks. The third way to capture movement in a subject is through suspended movement. And this essentially means you have a subject in midair. And the implication is that that subject is moving through the air, but you caught it in a single frame. So for example, check out this shot right here that I took of myself in Death Valley. So I jumped in the air and the movement is applied because of gravity. You can also use this for things like trucks that are going off jumps, or bikes, or even skateboarding. But the catch is you really want that subject to be in midair for maximum effect. If you use a long or a fast shutter when a car is just driving, for example, say you take it out like 1/2000th of a second, then that car is just gonna look like it's parked on the street and you're not gonna have that movement. So you want the subject to be in midair. The next technique I want to run through is called light painting. And this is an entire genre of photography on its own. So essentially what this means is you set your camera on a tripod with a long exposure, and then you run around with various lights within your shot and so-called paint the air. Since your camera is capturing a long exposure, it's going to create trails of wherever you draw that light to. So for example, one way to do this is with LED sticks. So you get a subject like a person that you want to stand in the shot like this, and then you can paint that LED behind her. As you can see, this artist used a circular shape behind her head to create a nice silhouette for her in the shot. And there's a variety of ways you can do this. If you just Google light painting portraits, you're gonna see a ton of crazy stuff that's gonna blow your mind. A lot of it looks like it's been done in Photoshop, but it's all been done within camera. Another popular way to do this is with steel wool. So steel wool is essentially this type of metal that you light and it creates these little sparks. And then when you spin it and you have a long exposure, those sparks are all gonna go flying and it's gonna capture the light trails of all those sparks flying through the air. So check out this shot right here where this artist stood on top of his car, spun that wool, and you could see all those sparks flying. It creates a really cool effect if you're able to manage this in the dark. Another way to use light painting is with drones. So you attach a LED to your drone and then fly it around a central subject in your shot. So for example, check out this shot right here of this building that was lit up by that drone flying, and it looks like he did some other light painting to light it up on its own. And then finally, the more obvious way to light paint is with fireworks. So an easy way to start is with sparklers, and especially if you can get some cool depth of field within the shot, you can get some bokeh of those sparkles happening in different depths. It's also great with just normal fireworks that are exploding on 4th of July, for example. So that is light painting. Lots of fun stuff to experiment with there. The next way to capture movement in a subject is through multiple exposures. So this is essentially where you have your camera on a tripod and then you have a subject that's going to do a certain action. While that action is happening, you maintain focus on that subject, put it on burst mode, and get a variety of shots of that action happening. So for example, a skateboarder flying through the air off a ramp. And then what you do is once you have all of these shots of that action sequence happening, you can go into Photoshop and using some basic masking skills, you can cut all of those shots together into one photo so you can see all of those different blips of the timeline of the event happening. So it's a cool way to put down action sports in a singular shot without having to create a full album. Another way you can capture movement in a shot is through zoom bursts. So this is where you put your camera on a tripod and you hold the shutter button and then you zoom in your camera while the shutter is open. So this is going to create an effect where these lines blur forward and it almost looks like hyperspace. Another effect that this can have is to make things look like they are 3D. So check out this shot right here of this artist who took a photo of their Netflix on the computer, and as you can see, that Netflix logo looks like it's floating through the air in this ghastly motion. So fun stuff with that. Just zoom in and out and put a slightly long exposure. The final technique I wanted to show you to capture movement in a subject is through stereoscopic photography. So this is essentially where you take 2 to 3 photos of a subject from a slightly different perspective and then you blend them all together in a GIF. And the effect creates an example like this. So as you can see, you get this almost 3D effect happening, and it's just a fun little party trick to have. So the way to achieve this is essentially you put your camera on a tripod, then you take a shot of your subject with it focused in the center. Then you move your tripod either 2 centimeters to the left or to the right, and then repeat. And you can do this 2 to 3 times, and then you just all mold them together into a GIF format, and it's gonna provide that nice bounce back effect. So one fun fact about this is you used to be able to do this all within a single camera. There's cameras out there called stereoscopic cameras, and they actually have mirrors that take the image from a slightly different perspective, so you don't have to go in and do it manually. But these cameras are a little bit older, they're a little bit more expensive, and they're pretty rare to find. So if you can get your hands on one, it's a very fun camera to mess around with. So those are all the ways I wanted to cover for movement within a subject. Now let's jump to movement of the eye. So how do we guide a viewer's eye through a photo? And the first way I want to demonstrate how to do this is with leading lines. So leading lines are essentially using lines like diagonals to guide a viewer's eye through the shot. So it starts at one point and then it ends at another point, preferably where your subject is. So here's an example of this in its most basic form. You have a single shot of me walking down this hill with this nice lined pathway that guides the eye towards me. You can begin to take this even further though, using something like the road, for example. So check out this shot right here. I took this photo of my buddy in Yosemite, and we got that nice leading line of that middle yellow line leading him as the subject, skateboarding down this road, and then we have that nice half dome photo of Yosemite in the backdrop. One final example just to drive this point home is this shot right here. So as you can see, we got this old rusting car, and then we got this hose that I actually aligned in this position to help guide the eye towards the shot. So don't be afraid to move sticks, move logs, move hoses, whatever you find in order to create leading lines on your own. The next way that you can guide the eye through a shot is with vignettes. And this is probably the easiest way to make your shots stand out if you're a beginning photographer. Essentially what you do is you darken the edges of the shot, and it just draws the eye forward into the image. Once you start to get more advanced with this, you can also use spotlights, which are the complete opposite of a vignette. So this is essentially where you use Photoshop to up the exposure or brightness of certain areas in your photo to help guide the eye towards that spot more. So as you can see, we're incorporating value into this movement of the eye. So that's everything I wanted to cover with movement. Lots of fun stuff to experiment with here. So let's jump into the next video.